Okay, welcome. Wednesday office hours. See if we can suffer with this size type today, among other things. Okay, welcome to Wednesday office hours. Today, we're going to look at some of the same things that we've been looking at for the last couple of weeks, and that is generally problems of value. But this idea of value, of course, as we know, you know, subjectively constructed, but clearly social. And I think you need to sort of get a sense of what does that mean in at least in the Marxian sense, but in a larger sense that it is what people are kind of reflecting on. So at the end, or towards the end today, we'll look at Soren Mao, MAU, the Dane, who has kind of resurrected, and I don't even know if it's Foucauldian, following Foucault, but he's trying to show how, Marx had a kind of idea about the body, a carceral, perhaps a carceral notion. I think he does reflect on it at various moments. And I think if you pursue it a little further, and it's not my job to do that, but it would seem to me that um, it would benefit from other more Hegelian things, as well as some 20th century stuff. And so that's not my job to sort of solve Soren Mao's place in all this. I mean, I think he's written a very good book. It's his dissertation, and he's got a bunch of articles. And I think he's going to get a lot of play because I think that there's a resurrection of the same kinds of things that we saw in the 70s and 80s as a kind of a sort of response to new interpretations. The readings of sort of the Marx Lenin stuff that gets uh, reassessed, uh, verges into what some people pejoratively call Western Marxism, and they do that for a variety of reasons. And it has reasons of the diamat, reasons of other things. There's a whole bunch of other things going on. So you need to be sort of careful about that. But that's kind of what we're going to do today, is that there are some ideas that perhaps got left behind, and they got left behind for good reasons, because there was a very specific denial of the labor theory of value sometime in the 1980s, and it did represent a certain body of Marxist thought, which has been revisited by some folks. That is, some people are rereading um, um, Jerry Cohen's book on Marxist theory of history, and have been rethinking the kind of logic of that. But I would assert that it's not revisionist thinking so much as it is a reasonable jumping off point, and you can see why some people who were more trained in analytic philosophy would look at Jerry Cohen's work and be attracted to the idea that it has a certain logical structure that is friendly to analytic philosophy. And the point is not to move towards analytic philosophy, because there's other alternatives. And I think that Badiou, there's a variety of other thinkers whose approach to analytics um, is perhaps a little more open as opposed to closed. And I would assert to you that the problem of analytic philosophy, without getting into a whole thing about it and its opposition to continental philosophy, et cetera, is this kind of open closed idea, but that kind of even misrepresents it. And I don't mean to just create a disservice to it, but it is that break between the Anglo-American and the continental. And yeah, it does seem a little geographic, but that kind of is the way it was for multiple decades. And needless to say, that is broken down at various moments. I mean, you could even say, you know, because we have this little thing, and it needs to be really sorted out. And I'm not my job. I hope someone will take it on. And that is, Wittgenstein actually knew Sraffa at Cambridge. So, and they there's a little bit about the interchange between them, but it's an interesting moment, and it my recollection is that it's a before. This is sort of during the Tractatus period of Wittgenstein, and as he moved towards what in his later life will kind of orient and of course confuse analytic philosophers, and that is rethinking certain ideas about knowledge and being rendered in a more open way. And you can see that relative to early 1950s philosophy, etc. And writing on it is on some of it has yet to be done, particularly in the way that, for example, Wittgenstein overlaps with the American part of the Anglo-American philosophy. Now, what does that have to do with political economy? Well, it kind of parallels it, and we're going to look at a little bit. We're going to look at that today. There's a concept called the differential ownership of productive assets, or DOPA, DOPA. It's a perhaps not a good acronym, but it does raise some interesting questions, and it comes from John Romer's work. John Romer is still alive; he's at Yale, and I'm going to do a little bit more on Romer, probably because I'm going to. Well, anyway, so it's worth looking at, particularly his more recent stuff on distributive justice. But we're not ready to get there yet, mainly because it's a lot of math. But the concept of a differential ownership of productive assets it's a good way to characterize the sets of issues that we've been looking at so far. That is the difference between things on the productive side, Department 1, and things on the distributional side, Department 2. And the idea, as we've talked about before, we have this multiple set, spiraling set, however you want to talk about them, of circuits of capital. And the way in which we kind of look at that is it has to be more flexible. It doesn't, well, as I read this, you'll see that there was a kind of a firmer line drawn between analytic Marxism and whatever other Marxism there was. Because there are a lot of other Marxisms. And analytic Marxism was an interesting idea from the 70s and 80s that evolved into other things. And I think you can see how it moved into other directions. And because of the critique that it was too positivist, too obsessed with methodological individualism, that it focused on a certain body of social science research that tended to be, on the one hand, it appeared quantitative, but it was more, it had some problematic elements to it, things that we might think about methodologically as positivist, but that's giving it such short shrift. The reality is, and ultimately, and I would assert that the methodological individualism argument does hinge on certain concepts about consciousness, social consciousness, or human consciousness, ultimately class consciousness. And um, it tended, because of certain positivist tendencies, to focus on individual elements, which then pushed some of it, and because it was parallel to it, for example, behavioral economics, or in a different direction, which is, I think, a more interesting direction, and that is sort of evolutionary theory, the sort of Bowles-Gintis sort of. And so, on the one hand, it exists sort of in the ether because it's relatively theoretical and clearly has math, um, but it was much more rigid in terms of the divisions, and it was rigid for perhaps all the wrong reasons, is that people would demonize it for perhaps all the wrong reasons, but you couldn't argue it because, if you were in a social science that really didn't appreciate the analytic elements, there would be this tendency to overcharacterize it, for example, rational choice, as a very specific kind of Marxism. And it's not a very specific kind of Marx. There is a literature that appreciates that, but I think people got too nuts about the rational part and then the choice part, because the choice part, obviously, well, not obviously, but it does relate to certain other neoclassical things and positivist things like social choice, et cetera, and all of which is a not really addressing the point, and that's kind of why there have been parallels throughout this kind of history. For example, the interest in social ontology exists in kind of a parallel moment in all of this, and there's a literature. It's not a problematic literature. It just some of the issues are scale issues. Much like Cockshot's work and a bunch of other folks, you sort of need to get a sense of how all these things, not so much that they fit together, but that they layer in a useful way. You can sort of see this, you're building a cake, a 30-layer cake, and you're trying to get the layers to sort of, trying to get the buttercream to fit. So anyway, so uh, today it's more Marx, more value, and the differential ownership of productive assets. And it we could get more crazy about this. We won't. I will be covering how I've put several different pieces on analytic Marxism in here. One that is the standard, or a standard, and I think in fact it's too simplistic, but it's the one from the Stanford um, Plato site, which is a really good resource. I mean, it's the kind of thing that you really wanted. Instead of reading Copleston or something, you read this as an undergraduate, and you would probably work things out better from a philosophy point of view. Not that that was my deal. It just, I happen to loiter in those places. But anyway, it has a little thing on analytic Marxism. It has a whole bunch of other things on a whole bunch of other interesting things as well. It has a couple of interesting gaps as well. But anyway, if you haven't looked at it, you should look at it, simply because it is relatively comprehensive, and it does provide a reasonably encyclopedic elements. So, all right. So this is from that Stanford place, and it only goes for a couple of paragraphs. So you'll sort of remember that this basic structure is the structure of the argument. You'll see it articulated by a couple of other folks who, while they're not the major lights, it's kind of a meta-analysis in the sense that it's a kind of overview done in this century of analytic Marxism, and it's not in amber. It truly is a set of ideas that is still not worth pursuing in a like you were going to build an entire research program on it, particularly from an empirical point of view. but one that is really necessary to frame what we've been looking at up till now, and that is different ways of considering the labor theory of value without getting too deterministic about it, which I would assert does happen. People would, you get a big argument about that. But I think if you've looked at all the stuff that we've been reading so far, you'll note that it's not quite as rigid as some people would have it. And particularly, as I've said before, it's a system of abstract ideas that interconnect and are not as problematic as you may think. And I think you can see that even, however you want to think about it, even analytic Marxism has a position on this that does not reduce it to methodological individualism. Rather, it allows for rethinking subjectivity and rethinking consciousness and ultimately rethinking class, because it ultimately gets there. If you read more of the literature, you'll actually see that they eventually get to class struggle, but it's just that before then, there's a whole bunch of reactions to it and bias and the usual academic tedium that obstructs thinking. And the problem, of course, is an Anglo-American problem. That is that you have very few Marxist departments in the United States, where you have a lot of Marxist departments in England, and so. And there has been tremendous cross-fertilization, certainly, but it ultimately is this other sub issue that uh, ultimately doesn't resolve its problems as Anglo-American um, political economy or philosophically driven political economy with continental philosophy and a whole variety of other points of view that deal with historical materialism, which does bridge. Historical materialism bridges all of this, and not to reduce everything to historical materialism, but it is a way of connecting all this craziness um, without getting too nuts. I mean, you can actually see some of the current literature by more junior faculty, more junior scholars who appreciate the range of questions. And fortunately, as I've said before, weeks and months ago, is that various scientific movements allow for that. So the entire kind of move towards Engels and social ecology, or a kind of Marxian ecology, however you want to read that. And yes, there's all kinds of variations built in that, which are also equally problematic. Some people insist on class, and some people insist on other stupid things, and it doesn't. At moments, it does not. It is too busy branding itself than to really address kind of the fundamental issues, ontological issues, ecological issues, and doesn't deal with them all at the same time, which is really stupid. But you can sort of see that there have been kind of research dead ends for those things, and yet people, there's a lot of literature out there. There's a lot more now than there was before. A lot of it repeats itself, which is what you've seen in these little things I do on Wednesdays, is to sort of repeat the argument, and it always seems a little redundant. Um, but that's kind of the way one can think about it, is that you're kind of circling the problem and you're trying to spiral into sort of, it's like an OODA loop. And at the end, you killed your prey. um, anyway, a first group of comprehensive criticisms focus on the methodological claims of analytical Marxism. The diversity of positive methodological approaches amongst analytical Marxists has been emphasized here, but there remains a shared negative premise, namely that there's no distinct and valuable Marxist method, none at all. And you want to get into this question of, all the premises are wrong, and this is going to the Samuelson Bortkowitz argument. There's no cohesive logic and blah 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 blah. But then when you actually start looking at stuff like G.A. Cohen's work, no, there's a logic to it. It gets a little stupid and formalistic or functional functionalist when you sort of read it closely, and so you have to sort of sit with it in a kind of perspective that includes, international elements, historical materialism, all that other stuff. But to claim that there is no distinct and valuable Marxist method is, an important premise, because as we saw a couple of weeks ago, that's kind of where Samuelson was headed. But you could see that the response to it from a Marxian point of view, is to say, you're barking up the wrong tree, because you only made a decision based on a certain kind of neoclassical logic, and you didn't apply it widely. But you can see that the response to Samuelson Borkowitz is also the analytic Marxist response to, and it not specifically to Samuelson Borkowitz, but it is addressing that kind of denial, and particularly because it's American rather than Anglo-American dominance. And you can look at it institutionally. There are just very few radical political economic departments. Everyone's kind of spread out in crazy places like Utah, or whatever. So, and Massachusetts, and et cetera. But ultimately, they all still come together, and that's the beauty of digital technology, better information processes. And I think we're, it may not be this generation, but the next generation is going to at least address some of these things, place them in their proper historical perspective, and then move forward. All right, and then we didn't get too far, did we? And there are critics who, holding that there is such a method and that it is superior to the bourgeois tools adopted by analytical, you see already, reject that premise. So you already see people choosing sides, which you don't have to do if you're adequately trained in methodological, in theoretical analysis, or research methodologies, or however you want to describe those kinds of issues. So, for example, they might maintain that Marxism is necessarily committed to a quote unquote dialectical approach, sometimes based on a wider philosophy of internal relations, which analytical Marxists are bound to reject. So you can see this internal relations issue here resembles Samuelson's rejection. And I'm not demonizing Samuelson. I think Samuelson would have gotten there. It's just that I think it was an indulgence of his to even comment on these matters. And I think it's a dalliance of, I think, it's the kind of thing that happens when you have too much time in your hands and you're going to get your Nobel Prize or whatever. Anyway, they might suggest that analytical and Marxist are rival methodologies embodying a tension that can only be resolved fully by one side routing the other. You see, this is that thing. And if you're kind of a dialectical materialist, you see it as a kind of a thesis antithesis, conquest. It's not that. And good Hegelians would sort of see that's not the point. The point is, as Marx describes it, it's the movement, it's the action of doing this, of dialectically engaging this process. And in that sense, it needs to be an open rather than closed process. But anyway, on this account, some September group participants are portrayed as remaining true to their analytical methods by slowly abandoning their Marxism. Now, that's I would assert that's taking it too far, but pretty clear that some people who we would agree are Marxists would do that for a variety of reasons. So, all right, we got to the first group. See, we're just plodding through this at a slow way. But I hope I've given you some kind of sense that this can be looked at in a more ecumenical way, and ways in which that are not alien to or antagonistic to, which is kind of the whole business of academia, to mainstream social science. So a second group of comprehensive criticism focus on the substantive concerns of analytical Marxism. hitherto, referred to as AM farther below. So just because of, we want to be efficient with syllables, I guess. The critical suggestion here is typically that in translating the substantive concerns of traditional Marxism into the language and frameworks of mainstream social science, analytical Marxism has lost what is valuable about them. Now, that's a, you know, I don't want to say it's a kind of straw argument, but it's a little, and it's not a complete argument. Uh, and once you look at stuff like, for example, in terms of Bellamy Foster, Engels, etc., that it's not so off the center, off the mainstream, that the methodologies actually are quite sympathetic to each other. And I think you'll see that in ecological and evolutionary logic stuff. That's that ultimately is the place one should think about that. So it suggests an analytical Marxist treatment of exploitation, class, and history involves an abstract, individualistic, and ahistorical framework that makes its conclusions hard to distinguish in many respects from the theories of bourgeois social science. Now, people like Wood, she makes an argument like that, but I think it's a little too. But recall that this is the end of the '80s into the '90s, and it's already on the decline, and it's sad. I was very sad when it happened, but you had to go, oh, okay, well, that's kind of, you have a couple of major anthologies. There are chapters in the kind of big handbooks for the field, et cetera, et cetera. And then it's been, sort of consigned as we started here today with a little place in, for example, the Plato site, the philosophy site for Stanford. And it's not fully articulated in the Stanford site, but I'm using it here as a kind of frame historical frame against which we sort of need to see how it operates. So, or in another area that analytical Marxists seem to have lost sight of, or never really appreciated the centrality of the system of labor to Marx's substantive account of human society. It's already problematic there. You see a decade passed and it got pigeonholed in a place that didn't fully address kind of some of the underlying issues, and also didn't look at kind of the parallel elements from other associated methodological developments. Sayre, for example, Kochschat is kind of an example of how methodologically we sort of still need to recover certain sets of relations, and we can get bogged down by our sort of insistent on certain analytical principles that may or may not be as important as we think, that are sufficient but not necessary. Let's put it that way. Anyway, a third and final group of comprehensive criticisms focus on the normative turn of analytical Marxism. Now, you see, that's automatically something that happens in a lot of fields, that there are normative turns in lots of different fields. And you could even argue that every social science goes through a normative turn, but and it occurs in different ways. For example, there was a mathematical turn, not a very good one, in geography. There's a linguistic turn in philosophy. There are various little turns that turn out that are, in fact, very normative positions that affect entire research programs, that is, entire bodies of work together, often, developing certain empirical things and getting results and being applied in certain ways that are interesting, and in other ways just stupid sort of results. But anyway, reacting against the suggestion that the predictive failures of classical Marxism, because the predictive failures is one of the things that people pillory Marxism with that. Well, if you're going to be a historical materialist, you should be able, because of historical materialism, be able to develop a framework that's much more predictive of certain things that you do. Your research should be able to derive certain predictive elements from it. But that's making that requirement doesn't it's fine if you're trying to challenge somebody for tenure or whatever, but in terms of hoop jumping. But the reality is that the problem is the activity is much larger and much more part of a it's not so much a normative turn as it is the question of what are the boundaries of a normal science in that sense. So normative clarification and argument, that's Jerry Cohen in 2000. Now, one variant insists that Marxism neither has nor needs a normative theory. That's clear for a lot of people, that you need to just sort of take it on faith that there's a labor theory of value, that you don't need to, work out the methodological things and try and communicate with, bourgeois social science or neoclassical economics or whatever. And yeah, it's a big job to try and learn all that stuff. But in fact, if you kind of learn a little bit about it, you begin to see, oh, that's not so much of a problem. And in fact, they limited their argument in order to get things get the logic to work out, right? Which is what Jerry Cohen himself does in terms of talking about Marx. But anyway, Marx is rather to be commended for holding that normative theory is pointless because it's motivationally ineffective or unnecessary. That's another way that you can argue that as well. Now, note that this is the person who wrote this. It needs revision, I suppose. But the Stanford little piece here tries to cover all these little things, and what I put in here is ones that sort of push out, fill in some of the gaps, not all the gaps, that open other ideas. And so we'll get to that probably by the end of my yakking today. Another variant criticizes the content rather than the fact. Content versus fact. That may not be the best way to characterize that, of analytical Marx's commitment to normative theory. For instance, normatively speaking, it suggests that analytical Marxism has increasingly fused and interpenetrated with left liberalism to a point where it's difficult to tell them apart. Now, without getting in a big fight with Bertram here, it seems to me that that's not a good conclusion and is oversimplifying the kind of history that's at work. And you wind up in this kind of sort of place that we were looking at a while back, that sort of demonizes the Frankfurt School or demonizes so-called Western Marxism or so-called non-anti-imperialist Marxism or whatever. The point, of course, and looking at these kinds of things, is that analytical Marxism actually can be used to support and develop in certain places and ideas. It's just that you need to know when to stop, or need to know what the limits are in the analysis, and not get too crazy about trying to get sort of normative results when in fact it may be in fact an impossible task, as one can claim for all normative theories. But anyway, these comprehensive criticisms are not directly challenged here, needless to say, because there would be a lengthy set of arguments. However, there are reasons at least to hesitate before endorsing them. And that's what I'm doing here. First, it might be too early for comprehensive criticism. Now, we're in the at 2026, or with the last revision of this was in the 20s. Too early for comprehensive criticism. Well, we can say that forever, but the point is, we actually need to sort of get down to it. Attempts at the latter, criticism that is, sometimes fail to consider that only a very provisional assessment of analytical Marxism as a research program might be appropriate at this point. Now, provisional assessment of analytical Marxism was going on in the 1980s. So, you gotta get past, this 40 years of provisional assessments. After all, many participants in the first wave of analytical Marxism, including Brenner, Romer, Bob Brenner, John Romer, and I can't remember what Van Parra's first name is, continue to produce significant and interesting work. They do, indeed they do, in different ways. Brenner has a whole other thing about, kind of international capitalism and, other implications of the emergence of, quasi-communist sort of things. Romer, as I said, is interested now, or was interested. I'm not sure where he is now, but in things that build off of notions of distributive justice and move actually to Kantian arguments, which is not uncontroversial. It gives you better kind of theoretical results, or it allows your theorizing to be better crystallized. But who knows whether that's the best way to proceed with the problem, but that's kind of why you do it. In addition, there are more recent contributions to consider, which offer the possibility of a constructive future development of the paradigm. We don't even know if it's a paradigm, with this whole business here. It is paradigmatic, but it's not. I think it's very hard to call it a paradigm. And if you call it analytical Marxism as a paradigm, I don't think you're really characterizing, it in a reasonable way, because you could argue, for example, that Singh, uh, um, no, that Anwar Sheikh is an analytic Marxist. He would not claim that he is, but in fact, his argument, his magnum opus, is, a essentially an analytic Marxist argument, and it's evolved because it's this thing he's been working on for decades, and it has certain clear or analytic elements built into it. And of course, he comes to different results, and it can be argued in a variety of other ways. And his students have argued in a particularly weird way, and et cetera, et cetera. And then, you see its overlap with the new interpretation, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, consider, for example, the acro-analytical Marxism. Oh, God, is that helpful? Not sure. But I may actually do a thing on this to, say, well, it's an interesting idea, but, is it really ultimately productive? Very roughly, Shelby approves of analytical Marxism, a methodological combination of analytical and empirical rigor, which is what I've been talking about all the time, all along, together with its substantive interest in exploitation and ideology, but regrets and seeks to make good its failure, both to theorize racism and racial hierarchy and to examine the place of the Black radical presence in the fight for social justice and a post-capitalist future. Well, that's just asking it to do more than it can do. I mean, I think you can see, if you follow, well, like Romer, for example, that you would naturally move to something that could discuss radical resistance and social justice, and that's kind of why he went a couple decades ago towards a distributive justice. I mean, that's not the only reason, but there's it's still consonant from a political point of view with down and dirty, community organizing, et cetera. It's just, you don't have to, deal with it in all those ways. And of course, there is the other issue of, without getting into a thing on DEI, blah, 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 there's intersectionality built into this. There's gender issues, there's, whatever. It's not reducing intersectional issues to non-class struggle issue or whatever. That there's a whole underlying argument there that kind of lost a lot of people for a decade or two, and which allowed, with all due respect, forces of reaction, the right wing, to develop better political position to screw with it in the academy. Anyway, more generally, the future of analytical Marxism looks open. Its research program does not appear close to future development, nor has it been replaced decisively by a competitor, which, it's not quite that, it's not zero sum in that sense. The intellectual merits of intellectual traditions, think of utilitarianism, for example, are not always exhausted by one's judgment of the first group of others with whom they are associated. Yeah, in utilitarianism, there's a whole bunch of other, sub-developments from utilitarianism that kind of are still around, but are not really, or they get merged into certain other kinds of ideas. And yes, you can argue that the neoclassical economics has a utilitarianism built into it, and even the sort of right-wing Hayekian libertarianism has a utilitarian component. Anyway, simply put, it might be better to leave the full autopsy until the death of the patient is more certain. So you can see the writer of this wanted to, sort of allow for development. So second, some of these comprehensive criticisms might appear to be unproductively preoccupied with the Marxist credentials of analytical Marxism, and that is true. And many arguments of those who might not call themselves analytical Marxists, but who essentially are arguing an analytical point, get tied up in whether it was or wasn't, or is or isn't Marxist, or Marxist enough, which underlies the entire argument that has been, been put forward by a bunch of folks. What's his name, Rockhill, um, uh, that non-anti-imperialist Marxism is, too bourgeois, too, it's the PMC argument, blah blah blah. Fine. It's just that it doesn't really get you anywhere to sort of argue through that. So Marxism is treated stipulatively as an honorific, and then this analytical variant is located beyond the pale, marginalized, exposed as non-Marxist, or not Marxist enough, or not Marxist in the right way, or even anti-Marxist. And this, this was a vital position, as you can see. Leibowitz, Hunt, a variety of other folks know this argument very well and managed to survive it for a variety of reasons. I mean, I don't think there's anything else to do aside skiing or whatever. Anyway, in Utah. But anyway, of course, this issue of whether and to what extent analytical Marxism is Marxist can take a legitimate form. It might, for instance, form a step in a more substantive argument, or the context might be one in which proper labeling is an appropriate concern. Intellectual history, for instance. Now, you have to unpack a whole bunch of things here, and some of it has to do with histories of ideas, taxonomical or typological approaches. It's, and a whole bunch of other things that aren't quite necessary, but you can see that it can point there. However, in the absence of further argument, it's just trying to move this ball forward. These criticisms can appear to adopt an inappropriately religious approach to the evaluation of ongoing research programs. See, ultimately, he's trying to, worm his way around this, because often, it was, as I mentioned 10 minutes ago, as a matter of faith, that you kind of invest in certain things that don't, that's the problem with some normative discourse, is that at certain moments, and if you don't, philosophically speaking, it turns into a matter of faith, which, there's a whole literature for that. Cohen expresses regret that historically it was the label Marxism, rather than say of, and Now, this is a dodge, but an interesting argument because there's an entire history of that. And rather than say that of scientific socialism, but there's a whole thing for that, that came to be associated with the relevant concerns and commitments. After all, it is typically religions rather than sciences, which are named after their founders, which it's a little gratuitous or whatever. Progressive disciplines are not expected to preserve the theses of their founders. Well, we do not, for instance, and this is, a little coy, I suppose. We do not, for instance, ask physicists whether they are sufficiently Galilean, assuming for the sake of the example that Galileo founded physics. There are a lot of bad premises built into this proposition, but being sufficiently Galilean is actually very necessary, but it doesn't get you anywhere. I mean, it methodologically it's important to have that structure. Otherwise, you wind up being a flat earther or something. So, you know, and founding physics is a whole different set of questions. It's not simply Galileo; it's a whole bunch of other things, Copernicus, blah 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 blah. Anyway, third and finally, some of these comprehensive criticisms look ungenerous and one-sided, making little effort to consider the potential achievements here. More positively, analytical Marxism might be said to establish itself as an intelligent and valuable form of quote-unquote Enlightenment Marxism. Now, you could argue, and it's unfortunate you can argue that, you could argue that all of those things that are demonized as quote unquote Western Marxism, the detour that Marxism took in the latter quarter of the last century, it that was Enlightenment Marxism. I don't think it is, but you could argue it. Its enthusiasm for clarity and careful elaboration of an honesty about, as I've tried to point out, arguments constitute contextually important reminders of significant intellectual virtues. Substantively, its evolving treatment of core Marxist concerns, and these are core Marxist concerns: historical development, right? Center periphery, north south, all that shit. Class, obviously, ruling class, the proletarians, the bourgeoisie, et cetera, and exploitation, which is a kind of a linchpin for arguing certain analytic ideas, and it's still a vital concept. It's just that you need to be careful about what counts as exploitation, relative to surplus value, et cetera, et cetera. So, reflect and confirm an openness to science, reason, and empirical evidence. As such, analytical Marxism recognizes and continues certain valuable and often neglected elements of Marx's own thought. G. In addition, analytical Marxism aspires to advance our understanding of the social world without abandoning or obscuring or disparaging the role of normative theory. And unless you think that's unimportant, there's always a normative theory sort of sitting in the back of certain people's heads. I mean, you could argue that dialectical materialism is built on a normative theory, and its normative theory can be seen as, if you only associate certain historical developments, it can really get you into trouble. Anyway, finally, his rejection of Marx's utopophobia is well-founded, and its corresponding efforts to explore and promote alternatives to capitalism in ways which balance the concerns of desirability and feasibility are imaginative and thought-provoking. How patronizing. Analytical Marxism, it might be suggested, rightly takes its place as one current of thought, current in a wider radical stream. It's this problem of staying in your lane, I guess, striving to understand social oppression and to contribute to its reduction and elimination. So you can make all these nice generalities about it. Ultimately, it still is about normative critiques, problems of praxis, of theory, in action, or practice in action, and critical practices in action. All of that is still important. It's not neglected. And analytical Marxism doesn't say, well, we figured it all out. It's perfectly logical, and this is the reason why it works. That's not what it does. Some people reify it as that and only identify it as certain people. Whereas if you look at uh, uh, the history of analytical methods relative to interpretations of, for example, Marx's 3+ volumes of Capital, you can see that there's other elements that are necessary to build the argument. Rosa Luxemburg is important for one element of the argument and articulates a certain dynamic historical element, but theoretically speaking, does not have or is not developed. So I mean, if you get killed by the Freikorps, you're really sort of losing your own anyway. So, needless to say. So there's a second little article here by Veneziani, Roberto Veneziani, of the rationality of analytical Marxism, and that may be, redundant, because the presumption, of course, is that it is "quote unquote" rational, and it obviously is a confabulation in one sense. If you look at the literature of the rational choice Marxism versus the analytical or analytic Marxism, and that division occurs in the historical literature about this, and it doesn't divide so easily. But if if you read this for yourselves, you can see that it it wasn't a dead end. It just simply that some people were building an entire research program, probably had graduate students running around, dealing with it, and it promoted, or because it was existing in parallel, other issues about value theory, TSSI, single system, temporal single system interpretations, are kind of a result of an analytic turn, and it does have normative components, and then you can get a big argument about that. But that's kind of what's doing. So during the 1970s, following the descending trajectory of structuralist Marxism, that's the the demon, and the renaissance of liberal egalitarianism, a strong wave of interest in Marxist themes emerged among Anglo-American analytical philosophers, Miller and Levine. The debate focused mostly on topics that were most congenial to analytical philosophy, such as the relationship between Marxism and ethics. Is a quite a useful literature. Nagel's work, I think, Nagel's work does that. At the culmination of this process, in 1978, Karl Marx's theory of history of defense appeared, in which G.A. Cohen reconstructed historical materialism guided only by two constraints. On the one hand, what Marx wrote, and on the other, those standards of clarity and rigor which distinguished 20th century analytical philosophy. Now, it's already, you can see that that's going to be a problem, because all of this, in the 70s is written before or recently after all these issues that we've looked at in weeks past about the differences in translation of Marx's work, and of course the advent from a couple of years ago of a new translation of Volume 1, which is not actually that different, but at least it reads better. We can say that. All right, the book, Cohen's Theory of History, the book marks the birth of analytical Marxism as a self-conscious school. In the following 3 decades, Analytical Marxism has provided some of the most controversial and sophisticated contributions on a number of core substantive and methodological issues in political philosophy and social sciences. The contribution of analytical Marxism to critical social theory is controversial, though, and it is unclear whether analytical Marxism identifies a distinctive, progressive, and Lakatos or Lakatos is I apologize to Anna. Sense research program in explanatory social science as claimed by some of its proponents. The core tenet of analytical Marxism is denial of a specific Marxist methodology and the adoption of the tools of mainstream social science and analytical philosophy in order to discover the quote unquote, well, my mind, rational kernel of Marxist theory, and then reconstruct Marxism on that basis. So you can see there's a revisionist, tendency built already into this that, you don't necessarily have to indulge. But yet, this is how the argument gets framed. Starting from these premises, analytical Marxism has indeed been able to translate some Marxist ideas into terms that bear scrutiny according to the most demanding disciplinary standards in mainstream philosophy or in appropriate social science. Analytical Marxism analyses, however, have led to the rejection or the radical revision of a number of concepts and propositions such that the viability of a distinctively Marxist, or indeed analytical Marxist, perspective in social theory is arguably put into question. So, that's the Stanford sort of Cliff's Notes version. Most critics reject analytical Marxism conclusions on a priori, methodological, and exegetical grounds, arguing that they follow from the adoption of mainstream tools that are, this is Samuelson again, extraneous to Marxist theory. It's this whole business of, about, well, it's logically inconsistent, but, you've already defined, some of the constraints under which you build your argument. So it's really, you've already marginalized its effect. But anyway, this approach is arguably questionable because many innovations in Marxist theory have derived from the encounter with, yes, non-Marxist traditions. See, it's never, I mean, it's not about being a Marxist. It's about having a more historical materialist approach, which is better to generalize. And as I've mentioned before, if people reach for their revolvers when they hear Marx, and it shouldn't be that problematic, but it is. Analytical Marxism should be judged by whether it illuminates central questions of social theory. And as acknowledged by critics, it does provide interesting insights on a number of crucial issues, such as, this is Cohen, the theory of history, the existence of exploitation and socialism, that's Romer, and the paradox of the middle classes, that's a whole bunch of other people. Besides, analytical Marxism propositions are interesting even when they are unconvincing. See, already the biased argument. The clarity and rigor of analytical Marxism writing greatly facilitate constructive criticism by exposing the crucial assumptions and gray areas of analytical Marxist theoretical constructions. Finally, analytical Marxism should be distinguished from the narrower approach, which I was mentioning above, also known as rational choice Marxism. Already this is, really dividing up the theories down to, kind of branding issues or whatever. Many critics illegitimately proceed from the critique of rational choice Marxism to the rejection of analytical Marxism. And this is the problem that occurred in the late 1980s and early 1990s, is far too many people, particularly those in the social sciences, would identify, critiquing rational choice Marxism, and by inference or whatever, by sort of side conclusion, fellow travelers, to the rejection of analytical Marxism. And I think that this is so. Anyway, Veneziani chapter, this chapter adopts a different approach. This is chapter 6 from a much larger book of his. First, analytical Marxism and rational choice Marxism are rigorously defined and clearly distinguished. It is argued that analytical Marxism has reconstructed a set of core Marxist propositions that are central in social theory and may contribute to a revival of socialist theory. Now, the underlying that comment, contribution to the revival of socialist theory, is about, the questions of, scientific socialism, which has other implications. By contrast, rational choice Marxism has given rise to a fertile literature on normative issues, as we looked at above, but its contributions to Marxism are mainly negative and suggest that the role of Marxism in the social sciences is exhausted. Second, various doubts are raised on rational choice Marxism's methodological prescriptions, in particular on methodological, and I've mentioned this before, on methodological individualism and rational choice theory. But the debate on alternative approaches is unlikely to be settled uniquely at an abstract methodological issue, methodological level. And yes, that's true. But it never was supposed to be solved uniquely at an abstract methodological level. So that's kind of another straw argument. But anyway, the point of rational choice stuff is to sort of consider, for example, John Elster's work and a bunch of other folks work on these general questions. And there is a literature for it, and it still is around. Because Veneziani's kind of yammering about this and trying to work it out for himself, because he's trying to sort of see the history in a sort of better light or context. Because half the battle in the social sciences is being able to reconcile shifts in paradigmatic shifts in argumentation, some of which are, built on relatively flimsy foundations or something. But that's a whole nother issue. So Przeworski writes on rational choice, and the classical text for Romer is General Theory of Exploitation and Class, from which there are other things that got written in the 80s, and which Romer tries to work through as well. It's questionable whether he got there or not, but at least he argued it, which was really important, the rational choice stuff, because essentially he was trying to meet the critique of anti-analytic discussions, trying to, well, you're just doing game theory. Well, that's not kind what it is. If you do game theory from a Marxian perspective, you begin to think about, well, that it's not a question of competition or competitiveness versus cooperation. And so fracturing that literature, that is to kind of forget about or to not emphasize as much, which is the unfortunate way in which, for example, game theory was taught in business schools, is largely to think about competitive, competition and market building, blah, 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 and not to think about collective or cooperative organization, where you have, in a game theory perspective, ways in which you can talk about how people can operate collectively or cooperatively, rather than the dominant laissez-faire Hayek neoclassical neoliberal things. And that's the kind of opposition that you need to sort of think about. Now, Romer has done a whole bunch of really interesting and good books that, but we'll talk about that probably sometime in the future. All right. Now, we argue here that, and I put in a thing because I wanted to suggest that as we build a theory of value that has, on the one hand, analytic elements, And as I've tried to point out, certain ways in which we talk about labor, that it's not about labor itself, but rather all those other things that we need in order to get to labor, and that is labor power, wages, all that other stuff. And the fact is that trying to locate those kinds of things in a digital context is the important element of the critique, for example, of blockchain and crypto. Um, One needs to, really hash that out, let's say. And we're not there yet, mainly because it's all this looting going on, and which is amusing, but nothing you want to kind of build your reputation on. Well, except if you're a tech bro, then you can be a hero, I guess. We argue here that digital spaces formed by technologies such as the internet are experimental spaces where capital seeks freedom from contemporary limits. So, and this is a little short piece on this. It's a development on Harvey's three spatial fixes. That is describing three experimental digital spatial fixes. Harvey talks about this in his later works, the works from the 90s, I guess. It's about spatial fixes. He actually mentions, I think, in the context of his last, the book before last on the Grundrisse. But anyway, spatial fixes we see operating in the current political economy, the primitive accumulation of time in social media, which addresses, Marx's original questions about exploitation, that it's a fundamental issue and are not fully explicated. I mean, you have the standard, relative and absolute and blah blah blah, and the working day and et cetera, but you really don't have a fully integrated idea about it. In other words, you can have people like Hudson and Graeber and other folks talking more anthropologically, but ultimately they still have other things that need to be worked through. And that is, for example, the primitive accumulation of time in social media. Number two, the annihilation of time by space. This is, gets us back to Harvey, David Harvey, the annihilation of time by space via financial infrastructure. There's a lot loaded in that one idea, but you can see that that's kind of where we are now, with all these people making money off of little small failing moves in the context of stock markets, for example. And it's a little insidious, and some people are not. There's no real critique of it in mainstream media, which is really unfortunate. In fact, someone could really make their bones on showing, how insidious it is. You can talk. I think people talk about it in more insidious ways, but they don't talk about it in mass media that way, and they really should. So anyway, and number three, the rise of affect rent in marketplaces for digital commodities. That's the whole business that Mazuoko's looking at in terms of attention and attention markets and other stuff. And that, on the one hand, that's measurable. On the other hand, it has problematic elements, because boils down to an identification problem, and it's hard to generalize from it, because it is so fractured, I suppose, or perishable, let's put it that way. We conclude by reflecting on the questions these conceptual foundations pose for further research, et cetera, the digital spaces, temporality of accumulation, and more traditional geographies of crisis. And the goal throughout is not to catalog the potential of digital spaces to act as spatial fixes. They don't. but to model a spatial approach to digital media. Now, that's just one component of it. And the larger question, particularly from a geography of crisis, would be, at least in my little brain, to look at the underlying problems of what counts as financial geography. There is a literature. There's actually a big literature in Europe. There's literally no literature, or very little literature in the U.S., although the Fed actually, or the Bureau of Economic Research, actually does a little work. Some of the Feds actually do stuff on this, but nobody does very much with it, which is really unfortunate. But that's America for you. Anyway, so I've included a little thing that talks about presentation on theories of spatial fix. The fix describes capitalism's insatiable drive to resolve its inner crisis tendencies by geographical expansion and restructuring. That's globalization, that's north-south, that's, center periphery. That's all those things are there. They're development problems. You can see when Higginbottom is talking about super profits and stuff, that's it's just a variation on this. Capitalism is addicted to geographical expansion as much as it is addicted to technological change and endless growth. And you can see that now. I mean, even though it's sort of this really stupid, it's like WWE is going on in the Strait of Hormuz, and it's just really dumb, but it's happening. And so we have to sort of think about it. Globalization is the contemporary version of capitalism's search for a spatial fix. And, whether the spatial fix idea is, I suppose it's symptomatic of David Harvey's just age or his, concerns. And it doesn't quite go where you need to move it, but that's kind of because, he's 90 years old or whatever. So, staving off over accumulation of capital with the spatial fix, exporting capital and labor to a new territory to start new production, migration of labor and capital across the Atlantic in the 19th century. Why is there a need for talking about spatial fix? Well, that's the history of it is sort of built on colonialism and imperialism, which we still have at the current in the current state, the current history. And why is there a need for a spatial fix if overaccumulation is registered as a lack of effective demand? This is what Marx is talking about in the volume 3, or what Mosley thinks, is Marx is talking about in volume 3, that opening up new markets is the solution. Well, it may not be. But it's an interesting argument, and the effective demand argument is always going to sort of sit there in the background. These are non-capitalist territories, the China market. That's arguable as well. So the issue is innovation is weakness, limits of urbanization, and this is, as I said, it's perishable in that sense. So why isn't it convincing? I don't think this overstates the argument, though. There is, in short, no spatial fix that can contain the contradictions of capitalism in the long run. I don't think you ever actually that's illogical, because containing contradictions is not kind of what you're supposed to be doing. Any fix is temporary, never permanent. Reproduces capitalism's contradictions, certainly does that. Moves problems around geographically. That's the current migration problem, and of course, current American imperialism. Why isn't it convincing? It is because of center periphery problems. Urbanization is one way to absorb surplus capital, but it is a limit in its self-freezing productive forces in a fixed spatial form. This is that whole kind of gravity models or whatever. So it already has a limit. It's nice that Harvey talks about it as, quote unquote, a spatial fix, but it doesn't move the research any further. That's the problem. Capital cannot abide a limit to profitability. Even more frantic forms of time-space compression ensue, impelling further technological innovation. Why isn't it convincing? Well, and this is kind of where we are now. And you can argue that that's kind of where uh, the people are making profit off the war. It's creative destruction, um, and destruction of investments, labor skill. All of that is going on. And people are just making money, and this is exploitative, certainly, off of chaos. And it's not an interesting chaos. It's just chaos. Uh, it's uncreative in one sense. So innovation thus exacerbates instability, insecurity, and ultimately pushes capitalism into periodic crisis, which we're back to from a Marxian model. But it's always been the problem of how is it that it's hard to predict. It's difficult to reconcile in a historical sense, but it does identify a kind of dynamic that it is sort of there. You can argue it, you can see it that it existed at various moments in time, but it's really problematic because it has, it's a macro, it's a big data problem. It's a size problem. So anyway, conclusion: the idea is a convincing one because we see it working, as I've just suggested, but inconvincing because of the lasting effects. So that's a little, side thing, but this opens us up to talking about virtual issues. Virtualization in the name of exchange value is the formula for the transition from industrial capitalism to virtual capitalism. Now, this is a big argument that, I'm probably going to start waging somewhere. Can we identify a virtual capitalism? Well, I think there's a virtual aspect to industrial capitalism, and it's clearly a virtual aspect to um, uh, financial capitalism, um, financial capital. And you can see that it has already created crises in 2008, but the virtuality of it, and that's kind of where Hudson comes in. Hudson identifies the actual argument of when stupid crap happened that caused all the markets to fuck up, and that's really interesting, uh, even predictable in retrospect. But a decent regulatory mechanism could have identified that and kind of fixed it or not allowed it to do what it did. But that's the problem: is that we don't have a good regulatory structure that combines all of these things that are necessary to sort of deal with. And in the case of the 2008 crisis, part of it was the difference between the New York and London. Ultimately, it was this kind of messing about, and you could say that it's virtual, but I don't know where that gets us. So anyway, some of the questions are, of course, rethinking capitalism, and virtuality arrives through the efforts of profit-making enterprises to find new markets when they are under stress. Virtuality sells. You see, I don't think that gets us anywhere. You can call it virtuality, but I don't think that is very explanatory. The essence of capitalism is to be whatever effective demand makes, as you were back to the demand problems, in a money economy. And that's kind of where the key is. It's why people study MMT. Because that's the sort of missing element, or the element that wasn't fully developed and that has a literature and isn't helped by either disclaiming Marxism or whatever, going in a liberal direction. I don't think either way really sort of helps MMT. But anyway, a capitalist economy oriented by exchange value, purchasing power determines production. And this, well, anyway, producers attempt to induce and seduce demand through the virtualizations of advertising and promotions, but it is too much to claim that they created. So, there's a hedging on your argument about virtuality if you really want to kind of argue virtuality. So you need to think that through. And I've included a diagram that might begin to address some of those underlying questions that I've raised earlier on, with the idea that labor labor occurs. It's human in that sense, that it is self-conscious and that it's a phenomenologically, stable or whatever. Um, and that if we were going to build an argument about virtualization, it would be one that includes both Department 1 and Department 2. Rather than the Frankfurt School viewpoint that the masses have been addled by repressive desublimation, we suggest, and this is the kind of, what's his name, Rocco, sort of partially argues that, we suggest that virtuality sells to a nihilistic will, a last man who goes to the virtual beach. Now, I don't quite know what they meant by that, but it is an interesting argument, because certainly it's clear that our president in the United States is kind of on a virtual beach and is on holiday. So anyway, now, I'm not big on a metaphor like a virtual beach, because I don't think that gets us anywhere either, but it's an interesting idea. Uh, uh, so virtual capitalism, a worldwide profit-making system, struggles mightily to serve a nihilistic will, of which it is an expression dash exchange value is already dead and infinitely mobile. So that's actually a more useful way of thinking about virtual and virtuality. I'm not sure, and this is what's his name, Paul C. at ctheory.net. Purchasing power rules in capitalism. Capitalism, the way by which purchasing power comes to prominence in the constitution of the the human's productive and consumptive relation to the world. Purchasing power demands virtuality, and capitalism is already virtual. It's kind of tautological, unfortunately, and so I'm not sure we get anywhere with. But I do like the idea that it's attempting to account for Schumpeter on what counts as creative capitalism or creative destruction, and that's still an important point, an important historical point that needs to be sort of worked through. Anyway, then I included another thing on that further developed Baudrillard and the more trendy sort of ideas. I don't want to get too far off there because it goes off into talking about Bourdieu and a bunch of other stuff. And I note that I am running out of time, as they say. So I included a piece by Guido De Marco on turnover time and Marx's decomposition of profit adjustment in the process of equalization. Now, that's a long way of saying, how is it that we get to, dealing with profit as a function of turnover, which is the underlying argument for what I've been talking about, the relationship between Department 1 and Department 2 and all these different circuits, is to account for them in ways in which we can measure turnover time without getting too tied up in accounting measures. But, that's another thing. And then I included the front and back end of Ian Wright's article on that we sort of looked at before, and that is right on the transformation problem, right? And the issue of Passanetti's vertically integrated subsystem, all of which serves a Straussian or a neo-Straussian kind of point of view, and that's all fine and good. I think it can provide the structure under which, even if you adopt a temporally single system interpretation on how to include but not over determine labor. So that's kind of what's going on with talking about vertical integration and a bunch of other things, and whether that's totally okay from a Passanetti point of view is another. A lot of arguments that go on here, but let me conclude. Let me read the conclusion that's writing about Passanetti. Passanetti's separation thesis and generalization of the vertically integrated approach are powerful analytic devices, right? We're still in analytic devices, and this is an analytic device that has developed since all that other analytic stuff. And it isn't that different, but it is in the sense that it follows that whole stream that goes back to Sraffa, uh, and which is, you can argue, is an oversimplification and even more oversimplified as a temporally single system interpretation. But anyway, however, Passanetti's specific proposal to restrict the labor theory of value to a normative role, a kind of logical frame of reference, is unnecessary. So this is where Ian Wright has moved, I guess, after he finished his dissertation, is to sort of, this is the dark area that I think that he's talking about. Passanetti's theoretical innovations, as I said, pointed in the opposite direction towards a full generalization of the classical labor theory and its reinstatement as the foundational theory of value for economic analysis within the production paradigm. So underlying this, and this is consonant with Anwar Sheikh. Ultimately, you can see kind of these, they kind of fit together. I don't know if Sheikh would agree, but I think they do. The more general labor theory spans both the natural and institutional stages of analysis, and therefore can address normative issues in the critique of political economy and positive issues in the analysis of specific economic systems. The more general theory sketched here in a initial and preliminary manner, this is just an article, right? It's not a book, admits both technical and social measures of labor cost and applies both kinds of measures in the appropriate context. For example, in this more general framework, classical labor values apply to distribution independent questions about an economy, such as measuring the technical productivity of labor or the surplus labor supplied by workers. Whereas the super-integrated labor coefficients apply to distribution-dependent questions, such as the relationship between relative prices and the actual labor time supplied to produce commodities, i.e. issues in the theory of value. So in two sentences, you see the relationship between Department 1 and Department 2. You see the issue of trying to do building off of the Straussian idea of the commodity and moving into what's necessary at the end of the century and the 21st century. The post-Straussian separation of the classical surplus to income distribution from its labor theory of value does not constitute a sophisticated rejection of naive substance theories of value, but indicates a failure to resolve the classical contradictions, such as, yes, Marx's transformation problem. The separation ultimately derives from the classical error of comparing technical with social cost structures. And that's kind of, Wright's whole thing, he builds off from his dissertation, is that you need to sort of separate out those things in Department 1 that are technology, and others that have an element that is not so obvious, commodity related. Then arguing that as a commodity is a whole different set of questions. But supply issues that we might apply and that would affect demand. Anyway, which is to explain what the unit of account might measure refer to, theorems 1 and 2, which demonstrate the production prices are proportional to physical quantities of labor, start to put the pieces back together again. This encapsulates the point I've been trying to make, and that is, you can think about labor in this kind of very palpable way, but you also need to, at the same time, consider that there is other sets of abstraction that could be measured from a labor point of view, but they can't be measured directly. They have to be indirectly, as I've said, indexically, kind of thought about, and that's kind of where we are. And then I included Soren Mao's a little bit from Soren Mao's. It's an article by Soren Mao where he talks about the body, and that's the reason why I was just a moment ago I was talking about abstract labor, is because Mao is attending to MAU. Mao is attending to corporeal dimensions of the capitalist organization of labor, rather than more general insights about human corporeality on a higher level of abstraction. There is a preference in this literature for a humanist interpretation of the young Marx. You see, he's kind of recapitulating the argument that went on in the 70s or whatever on the so-called humanist Marx. Centered on the notion of alienation, accommodating Marx's analysis of commodity fetishism to a romantic critique of the commercial culture of late capitalism. That's where Frankfurt School goes. The aim of this article is to show that Marx has a lot more to say about the body than he usually gets credit for, but not out of some hagiographical desire to prove that Marx is right about everything before everyone else, but because I, that is Soren Mao, believe that his unique approach to the body contains insights which can make a meaningful contribution to the corporeal turn. And the corporeal turn is the thing that Foucault sort of is symptomatic of, this whole business about focusing on the body as opposed to a person in that sense. But anyway, and yes, historicity is part of that argument. Anyway, right. And so I close with a fairly complete article. It's a 29-page article, but it's all spaced out. It's in Word, so it's really only about 10 or 15 pages. But this describes the in a pretty decent way. I mean, there's other issues you can, but in more specific detail, what we looked at the front end today, and that is analytic Marxism is not just one thing, it's many things, and useful because it kind of, keeps people honest. It's not just matters of faith. It is questions of very specifically about exploitation, um, history, other class. All of those things are still there. It's just that analytic Marxism reminds us that we need to sort of think about them in a variety of ways. And this one does have it actually it actually is argued not unlike the way that Cohen argues. So it's actually a useful little article from that point of view. Anyway, so I include that. Where are we on time? Oh God, I ran over time. As you note, I can just keep yammering on. I won't. We'll stop yammering now. And thank you very much for your attention. I will include the link to the Medium page and hope